Dawn broke gray and wet over Port Moresby on March 1st, 1943. At 6:30, Major Ed Lner stood on the rain-slicked coral runway, his gaze fixed on the B-25 Mitchell bomber cruise, prepping for a mission labeled impossible by High Command. At 31, he'd logged 72 combat sorties, not a single enemy ship to his name. Meanwhile, 16 vessels had departed Rabaul, 8 transports crammed with nearly 7,000 Japanese troops bound for Leh, flanked by 8 destroyers. American intelligence had intercepted word of the convoy's departure, and every transport that reached its destination would mean another blood-drenched jungle slog for Allied forces to dislodge the enemy. Lehner's dilemma was stark. Traditional high-altitude bombing, strafing targets from 10,000 feet, gave Japanese captains all the time they needed to dodge. They'd watch bombers climb, calculate bomb trajectories, and steer clear of the splash zones. For 8 months, 5th Air Force B-17S had hammered convoys with a paltry 3% hit rate. Most ordnance exploded harmlessly in the open ocean. The math was unforgiving. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from altitude took 37 seconds to hit the water. In that span, a destroyer cruising at 30 knots could cover 380 yards, more than 3 football fields. Pilots aimed for where a ship was. Bombs landed where it had been. Lner had witnessed this failure mission after mission. Bombers returned with photos showing tight bomb patterns around ships, never on them. Crews claimed direct hits that turned out to be near misses. The Japanese kept sailing. American bomber losses kept mounting. 4 aircraft and 40 men lost in the past month alone. High-altitude bombers were sitting ducks for Japanese gunners, who tracked their approach methodically, calculated lead times, and bracketed formations with deadly flak. By the time bombs fell, half a squadron could be in flames. Then came General George Kenney's insane proposal. Skip bombs across the water like flat stones. Fly at 50 feet. Release ordnance 300 yards from the target with a 5-second delay fuse, letting momentum drive the bomb into a ship's hull. Skipping once, maybe twice before detonating on contact or just below the waterline. Theorists swore it would work. Pilots called it suicide. Flying a twin-engine bomber at wave-top height straight into a hail of anti-aircraft fire violated every survival instinct Lner had honed. Japanese destroyers bristled with 127mm main guns, 25mm cannons, and dozens of lighter weapons. High Command had banned the tactic twice, dismissing it as reckless, experimental, unproven. Lner's request to practice skip bombing had been shot down in December and January. Officials ordered crews to stick to proven high-altitude tactics. But those tactics weren't sinking ships. Lner strode to the operations tent and spread reconnaissance photos across the planning table. The convoy had been spotted at dawn, steaming southeast through the Bismarck Sea. 8 bulky transports in 2 columns, destroyers screening their flanks, every deck packed with soldiers, artillery, and ammo. If those ships reached Leh, the New Guinea campaign would drag on for another year. Lner had a plan, one that would either validate Kenney's low-altitude gamble or get 60 American airmen killed before lunch. The convoy would enter striking range at 9 a.m. 3 hours to prepare, 3 hours to teach his pilots to fly like they'd never flown before. He summoned his squadron leaders and laid out the forbidden practice runs. The B-25 was never built for this. Designed for medium-altitude level bombing, its twin Wright Cyclone engines could push it to 300 miles per hour in level flight. But speed meant nothing if Japanese gunners had 30 seconds to track the approach. Kenney's modifications changed everything. Mechanics had ripped out the nose bombardier position and installed 8 50-caliber machine guns pointing forward. 4 in the nose, 4 in fuselage blisters, turning the bomber into a flying gun platform capable of unleashing 200 rounds per second. The strategy was brutal simplicity. Suppress enemy anti-aircraft fire with machine gun barrages during the approach, forcing gunners to choose between returning fire and staying alive. 3 weeks earlier, Lner had watched mechanics bolt the guns to his aircraft, adding 1,200 pounds and shifting the center of gravity forward, creating a hybrid between an attack plane and a maritime strike fighter, a machine that had never existed before. The practice runs had been top secret, conducted at dawn and dusk when light was poor and prying eyes were few. Kenny had secured a perfect target, the Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground on Nader Reef near Port Moresby in 1924. The rusting hulk sat half-submerged, a ghostly stand-in for Japanese warships. Crews learned to skim the wave tops at 270 miles per hour, to time bomb releases with surgical precision, and to learn the hard way what happened when they got it wrong. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett learned that lesson on February 16th. He'd come in too high, 70 feet instead of 50, and his bomb skipped twice, clearing the Pruth entirely before detonating 300 yards beyond the wreck. Fawcett's bombardier, Sergeant Mike Russo, recalculated: lower, faster, closer. On the next run, Fawcett hugged the water at 45 feet. The bomb skipped once and slammed into the Pruth's hull just below the waterline, right where a ship's magazine would sit, right where one well-placed bomb could detonate 1,000 tons of ammo and split a destroyer in two. But the Pruth wasn't shooting back. Back in the operations tent, Lner jabbed a finger at the lead transport in the reconnaissance photos. 800 feet long, 10,000 tons displacement, capable of carrying 1,500 troops. The convoy's flagship. Every officer in the tent knew the stakes. Japanese reinforcements had turned the battle for Buna into a 6-month nightmare that cost 5,000 Allied casualties. Leh would be far worse if those transports unloaded. Skip bombing demanded precision no bomber crew had ever attempted. 50-foot approach altitude, 270 miles per hour speed, 300-yard release point, 8-degree bomb trajectory angle, 5-second delay fuse. Miss a single variable, and the bomb would either skip over the ship, detonate short, or hit the water at the wrong angle and sink without exploding. Lner assigned each pilot a specific target: transports 1 through 8, destroyers as secondary targets if the transports were already ablaze. No bomber would attack the same ship twice. Maximum efficiency, maximum destruction. 1 pass, 1 bomb, 1 chance. At 7 a.m., crews filed out to their aircraft. 9 B-25s, 54 men. The plan was layered. 13 Beaufort fighters from the Royal Australian Air Force would strafe the convoy first, suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Above them, 16 B-17 Flying Fortresses would bomb from altitude, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver and break formation. P-38 Lightning fighters would keep Japanese Zeros occupied at high altitude. But the killing blow would come from Lner's 9 bombers, screaming in at 50 feet. Lner climbed into his cockpit at 7:15. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Benz, was already running through pre-flight checks. His bombardier, Staff Sergeant Carl Walls, was testing the bomb release mechanism for the 4th time. No one spoke. The crew had flown together for 9 months. They knew what a 50-foot approach meant. They knew the odds. Lner fired up the port engine, then the starboard. The right cyclones roared to life, a familiar throaty growl. Around him, 8 other B-25s sputtered to life. The formation would take off in the flights of 3, Lner's flight first, staying low over the water the entire way. Japanese radar couldn't track aircraft below 100 feet. Surprise was their only advantage. At 7:45, Lner released the brakes and began his takeoff roll. By 9:30, he would know if Kenny's theory was a stroke of genius or if he'd led his entire squadron to slaughter. The flight to the Bismarck Sea took 90 minutes. Lner kept his formation at 30 feet, so low that spray from wave crests spattered his windscreen. The B-25s flew in a loose V formation, 200 yards apart, close enough to maintain visual contact, far enough that a single flak burst couldn't take down 2 bombers. Radio silence was absolute. The Japanese monitored every frequency. One stray transmission would alert the convoy that American bombers were inbound. Surprise was worth more than coordination. Lner checked his watch. 8:30. According to morning reconnaissance, the convoy should be 60 miles northeast, steaming at 12 knots toward the Viyaz Strait. The ocean below was empty. No whitecaps, no patrol boats, just endless blue stretching to the horizon. Flying this low, visibility was limited to 5 miles. The convoy could be anywhere. Navigation had to be perfect. A 5-degree course error would mean missing the target entirely. approach from the wrong angle, and destroyers would have time to train their main guns on the bombers. At 8:52, Lner spotted smoke on the horizon, black diesel exhaust from 16 ships steaming in tight formation. He clicked his throat microphone once, the prearranged signal to tighten the formation. His wingman acknowledged with single clicks. Radio discipline held. As they closed in, the convoy took shape. 2 columns of transports, 4 ships each, destroyers forming a protective screen 2 miles ahead and on both flanks. Lner counted gun positions on the nearest destroyer. 6 main turrets, dozens of smaller weapons. Every gun would lock onto his formation the second they broke the horizon. At 8:57, the Beaufort fighters struck. From 3 miles out, Lner watched 13 Australian aircraft dive on the convoy from the northeast, their 20mm cannons raking destroyer decks. Tracers arced across the water. Japanese anti-aircraft guns swung toward the new threat, exactly as planned. The Beauforts weren't there to sink ships. They were there to make gunners look the wrong way. 30 seconds later, the B-17S arrived, bombing from 10,000 feet. Lner watched bomb bay doors swing open, ordnance tumbling toward the sea. Japanese ships executed evasive maneuvers, turning hard to port and starboard. Columns broke apart, spacing between ships increased. Destroyers accelerated to flank speed, white water churning at their sterns. Confusion. Perfect. Lner pulled back on the throttles and descended to 40 feet, airspeed dropping to 260 miles per hour. Walls called out distances: 4,000 yards, 3,800, 3,600. Each ship in the convoy was now clearly visible. Lner locked onto his target, the second transport in the port column, 700 feet long, riding low in the water, fully loaded. His bomb would hit amidships, right where troop compartments bulged with Japanese soldiers. The destroyer on the left flank spotted them. Lner saw muzzle flashes. The first shells arced toward his formation, too high. Japanese gunners were used to tracking bombers at altitude. They hadn't adjusted for a 50-foot approach. At 2,000 yards, Lner opened fire. All 8.50 caliber machine guns roared to life, tracers walking across the transport's superstructure. Glass shattered, metal sparked, men on deck dropped or dove for cover. The suppression was working. Anti-aircraft crews couldn't shoot back while bullets tore through their positions at 800 rounds per minute. At 1,200 yards, Lner's wingmen spread out, each bomber lining up on its assigned target. The formation fragmented by design, 9 bombers attacking 9 ships simultaneously. No time for defenders to shift fire, no time to coordinate a response. At 800 yards, the destroyer's main guns fired again. This time, shells bracketed Lner's flight, left, right, close enough to rock the aircraft with concussive force. Shrapnel pinged off the fuselage. Benz called out, "Damage report. Port engine oil pressure dropping, but still in the green." At 600 yards, the transport filled Lner's windscreen. He could see individual soldiers scrambling for cover, bridge windows glinting in the sun, gun crews swinging their weapons toward him. The ship rushed closer at a combined closing speed of 300 miles per hour. At 400 yards, Wall's voice cut through the engine roar. "Bomb armed, ready for release." At 300 yards, Lner pressed the bomb release button. He felt the aircraft lurch upward as 1,000 pounds of ordnance dropped free. The bomb tumbled forward, carried by momentum, hit the water nose first, skipped once like a flat stone, and arrowed straight for the transport's hull. Lner hauled back on the control yoke, climbing hard. The 5-second fuse counted down. The bomb detonated at the waterline. Lner didn't see the explosion. His vision was filled with sky, but he felt it. A shock wave slammed into the aircraft, lifting the tail and throwing the B-25 sideways. Benz fought to regain control as the altimeter spiked. 100 feet, 200, 300. Lner risked a glance back. The transport was splitting apart. A column of fire and black smoke erupted from amidships. The hull buckled, metal shrieking in protest. Secondary explosions rippled through the superstructure as ammunition stores cooked off. The ship listed sharply to port, already taking water through a massive gash torn in its side. Dozens of soldiers jumped overboard. Tiny figures abandoning a dying vessel. One bomb, 15 seconds from release to catastrophic damage. Skip bombing worked. To Lner's right, Fawcett's bomber pulled up from its attack run. Another transport was burning, flames climbing its forward mast. To the left, Captain Bill Hayes had released his bomb on a destroyer. It skipped twice and hit below the aft turret. The destroyer's stern lifted out of the water in a blinding flash of an internal explosion. When it crashed back down, the entire rear third of the ship was gone. It began settling by the stern, sinking fast. 4 targets hit in the first 90 seconds. The Japanese convoy descended into chaos, but the defenders were adapting. A destroyer on the far flank turned to face the bombers, its main guns firing in rapid succession. Shells walked across the water toward Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first missed by 50 yards, the second by 20, the third hit dead on. Mitchell's aircraft disintegrated in midair. The bomb under its fuselage detonated on impact, vaporizing the bomber instantly. No parachutes, no survivors. 5 men gone in the blink of an eye. Lner watched debris scatter across the water. No time to process the loss. No time to mourn. The attack raged on. The remaining B-25s pressed their assault. Lieutenant Carl Johnson lined up on the lead transport. The convoy flagship, his approach textbook perfect. 50 feet, 270 miles per hour, machine guns blazing. The Japanese crew fought back with everything they had: 20-millimeter cannons, heavy machine guns, even rifles. The air between Johnson's bomber and the transport was a curtain of tracers. His bomb release was flawless. It skipped once and punched through the transport's hull just forward of the bridge. The delay fuse gave it time to penetrate deep into the ship before detonating, tearing through 3 decks. Fire erupted from cargo holds, packed with ammunition, artillery shells, and fuel drums. The transport became an inferno. Men burned on deck, trailing smoke as they jumped into the sea. Lieutenant Paul Warren's bomber took heavy hits during its approach. A Japanese gunner on a destroyer had finally adjusted for the low-altitude attack, and 20-millimeter shells ripped through the port wing. Fuel streamed from a punctured tank, but Warren held his course. 300 yards, 200. At 150 yards, he released his bomb. It skipped and struck a transport below the waterline. Warren banked hard right, trailing fire. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Dave Miller, activated the fire suppression system, and the flames died down. The bomber was still flying, barely. 6 transports burning or sinking. 2 destroyers damaged. 1 B-25 lost. The attack had lasted 4 minutes. Then the second wave arrived. 9 more B-25s from the 91st Bomb Squadron, led by Major Ralph Chell. They'd watched Lner's assault from 5 miles out, knew the tactic worked, knew the cost. Chell's formation spread out, each bomber selecting a target from the ship still afloat. But the Japanese were ready this time. Every gun in the convoy tracked low-altitude targets, destroyers forming a defensive line, their main batteries firing with deadly, calculated precision. The enemy had learned from the first attack. They would make the Americans pay for the second. Chell's bomber came in from the east directly into the sun, a smart move. Japanese gunners were half-blinded, firing at shadows. His bomb hit a transport already listing to starboard. The explosion accelerated its sinking, and the ship rolled onto its side and went under in less than 2 minutes, taking 1,200 soldiers with it. Lieutenant Harold Jensen wasn't as lucky. His approach angle was wrong, too shallow, too fast. His bomb skipped 3 times, cleared the target destroyer entirely, and detonated harmlessly beyond the convoy. Jensen pulled up and circled for a second run, but the destroyer he'd missed tracked him the entire time. When Jensen came around for another pass, the destroyer was waiting. The first shell took off his port engine. The second hit the cockpit. Jensen's B-25 rolled inverted and crashed into the sea at 300 miles per hour. No explosion, just impact. The ocean swallowed the aircraft whole. 2 bombers down, 7 transports sinking, 3 destroyers crippled. The battle had raged for 8 minutes when Lner realized with cold clarity that the Japanese still had 60 Zero fighters somewhere above the clouds. The Zeros appeared at 9:15, 18 of them, diving from 12,000 feet like silver hawks hunting field mice. Lner spotted them through scattered clouds. The P-38s were supposed to keep them occupied, but something had gone wrong. Either the Lightnings were outnumbered, or the Japanese had committed a second fighter group no one knew about. Lner's B-25 was vulnerable. Low on fuel, low on ammunition. The nose machine guns had just 200 rounds left, not enough for a sustained dogfight, not enough to hold off a determined Zero pilot who'd learned to fear American bombers. He pushed the throttles forward and dove to wavetop height, 20 feet, 15. Propellers churned salt spray, the aircraft vibrating violently. The Zeros split into two groups. Half stayed high to engage the P-38s, the other 9 dove after the bombers, coming in fast at 400 miles per hour, firing 20-millimeter cannons from 1,000 yards out. Lner saw tracers arc past his canopy. Too close. He jinked left, then right, making himself a difficult target. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake manned the dorsal gun turret, firing short, controlled bursts at the nearest Zero. The Japanese fighter broke off, not damaged, just cautious. Warren's damaged bomber wasn't so fortunate. A Zero latched onto his tail and refused to let go. Warren tried every evasive maneuver he knew, climbs, dives, hard banking turns that stressed his already damaged wing. But nothing worked. The Zero pilot was good, patient. He waited until Warren ran out of airspeed during a climbing turn, then fired a 2-second burst. Warren's starboard engine exploded. The bomber nosed over and plummeted into the ocean. Lner saw 3 parachutes blossom, 3 survivors out of 5. Better than nothing. The Zeros pressed their attack for 6 minutes, then abruptly broke off and climbed. Lner didn't understand why until he looked up. The B-17s were returning for a second high-altitude pass. The Zeros had to choose, attack the bombers below or defend the convoy from above. They chose the latter. The heavy bombers posed a bigger threat to what remained of the Japanese fleet. Lner used the reprieve to assess damage. His port engine was running rough, oil pressure fluctuating wildly. The fuel gauge read 60%, enough to make it back to Port Moresby maybe. He glanced back at the convoy. 8 transports hit, 7 sinking or already gone, the 8th burning but still afloat, limping toward the New Britain coast. All 4 screening destroyers were damaged. 2 dead in the water, the other 2 circling the burning transports trying to rescue survivors. The battle wasn't over. It was 9:25, and the fight would rage for 3 more days. American bombers would return every 6 hours. PT boats would hunt survivors in lifeboats. The Japanese had sent 7,000 troops in the convoy. Fewer than 1,200 would make it to Lae. The rest would drown, burn, or die of exposure under the tropical sun. Lner set course for home, his formation scattered across 30 miles of ocean. 4 bombers confirmed lost, 20 men dead or missing. But the mission had worked. Skip bombing had proven itself in the most brutal way imaginable. The technique would be refined, standardized, taught to every bomber squadron in the Pacific. Within 6 months, Japanese commanders would abandon all attempts to move large convoys within range of Allied air power. Their supply lines to forward bases would choke. The tide of the war would turn. But Lner didn't know that yet. He only knew his fuel gauge was dropping, his engine was failing, and Port Moresby was 90 minutes away. He ordered his crew to jettison everything non-essential: extra ammunition, unused guns, tools, spare parts, anything to lighten the load. The B-25 struggled to maintain altitude with one engine sputtering. At 10:10, Ben spotted land, the southern coast of New Guinea. They were on course, barely. The port engine was shaking violently now, oil streaming from a crack in the housing, temperature gauge climbing into the red. 5 more minutes and it would seize completely. Lner feathered the port propeller and diverted all power to the starboard engine. The bomber slowed to 180 miles per hour, just above stall speed, just enough to stay airborne. The coast drew closer. 40 miles, 30, 20. The engine held. Lner landed at Port Moresby at 11:17. The runway was lined with ground crews, mechanics, and intelligence officers. Word of the attack had spread, but no one knew how successful it had been. Lner cut the engines and sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds, hands still gripping the control yoke. Ben sat silent beside him. Neither man moved. They'd been flying for 3 hours and 42 minutes. It felt like 3 days. The debrief lasted 2 hours. Lner and his surviving pilots sat in the operations tent as intelligence officers asked the same questions, over and over in different ways. How many ships hit? How many sinking? How many bombs released? How many aircraft lost? The officers pieced together a picture from fragmented accounts. 9 pilots attacked, 5 returned. Mitchell gone, Jensen gone, Warren in the water. His crew picked up by a Catalina flying boat, 2 men wounded. Reconnaissance photos arrived at 1300 hours. An Australian Beaufort had photographed the convoy from 15,000 feet at noon. The images told a story Lner's crew couldn't. 8 transports, 7 confirmed sunk or sinking. The 8th beached on the New Britain coast, burning fiercely. 4 destroyers, 2 sunk, 2 severely damaged, limping back toward Rabaul. Total time from first attack to last ship going down, 3 hours. General Kenny arrived at Port Moresby at 1600. He walked straight to the operations tent, spread the reconnaissance photos across the briefing table, and didn't waste time with congratulations or handshakes. He pointed at the burning transport beached on the coast and said, "Finish it." Australian Beauforts would launch another strike at dusk. Nothing could be allowed to reach Lae. Nothing. The second strike took off at 5:30 p.m. Lner didn't fly. His bomber needed a new engine. Instead, he stood on the runway and watched 9 fresh B-25s roar into the setting sun. They'd reach the target at dusk. Japanese survivors would be scrambling to salvage what they could from the beached transport, never expecting another attack. They were wrong. The strike returned at 2000 hours. The beached transport was gone, sunk at its mooring. The 2 damaged destroyers had been caught trying to withdraw. Both hit, both sinking fast. The Japanese had started the operation with 16 ships. By nightfall on March 2nd, 14 lay at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The remaining 2 destroyers limped into Rabaul at midnight, barely afloat. The human cost was catastrophic. Of the 7,000 Japanese soldiers who'd embarked at Rabaul, reconnaissance flights over the next 2 days counted approximately 900 survivors reaching the New Britain coast by lifeboat or swimming. American PT boats intercepted most lifeboats. Some survivors were rescued, others killed in the water. The line between combat and massacre blurred over those 3 days. Command had ordered no quarter. The Japanese had machine-gunned American airmen in parachutes, and the Americans returned the favor to soldiers in lifeboats. Lner learned about it 3 days later. He didn't ask for details, didn't want to know which PT boat crews had fired on lifeboats, which bomber crews had strafed survivors swimming for shore. The war had rules until it didn't. Those rules had dissolved somewhere between Mitchell's bomber disintegrating and the last Japanese transport slipping beneath the waves. No one talked about it. No one wrote it in after-action reports. But it happened. The final casualty count came through on March 7th. Japanese losses: 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, approximately 3,000 troops drowned, another 1,500 killed by air attacks. Just 1,200 men reached Lae, stumbling overland through the jungle, weaponless, supplyless, disorganized, combat ineffective. The reinforcement mission had failed completely. American losses: 4 B-25s, 1 B-17, 2 P-38s, 13 airmen killed, 6 wounded. Against an entire Japanese convoy, the exchange rate was absurdly one-sided. Skip bombing had worked, but it worked because Lner's crews had been willing to fly straight at destroyers at 50 feet, while anti-aircraft fire turned the air into a storm of shrapnel and lead. Courage didn't cover it. Insanity was closer to the truth. Kenny called it the most decisive air-sea battle of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto called it a disaster. The Japanese Navy immediately canceled all future large convoy operations within range of Allied land-based air power. The supply line to New Guinea was severed. Garrisons at Lae, Salamaua, and Madang would have to survive on what they had, and they wouldn't survive long. But the Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed more than Japanese strategy. It changed how every air force in the world thought about attacking ships. The Americans refined skip bombing, the British adopted it, the Soviets copied it. By 1944, low-altitude bombing had become standard doctrine for maritime strike aircraft worldwide. Lner flew 16 more missions before rotating home in May. He never spoke publicly about the battle, never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir. He'd done what was necessary. That was enough. The question no one could answer was simple. Would the same tactic work against a prepared enemy? The Japanese tested that question 3 months later. On June 3, 1943, American reconnaissance spotted another convoy forming at Rabaul. 6 transports, 8 destroyers. This time, the Japanese sailed at night, with 60 Zero fighters providing round-the-clock air cover. This time, every destroyer carried extra 20mm anti-aircraft guns, specifically positioned to defend against low-altitude attacks. They'd learned from the Bismarck Sea. They'd adapted. The 5th Air Force attacked at dawn, 12 B-25s using skip bombing. The results were drastically different. 2 transports hit, 1 destroyer damaged, 3 B-25s shot down. The exchange rate had shifted. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses had improved dramatically. Gunners who'd survived the Bismarck Sea had trained their replacements, teaching them to track low, fire early, and concentrate fire on bombers during the final approach when aircraft were committed and couldn't maneuver. The Americans adapted in turn. By July, 5th Air Force mechanics had installed additional armor around cockpits and engines, increased forward-firing armament to 12.50 caliber machine guns. Some B-25s carried 14. The theory remained the same: suppress defensive fire with overwhelming firepower during the approach, giving enemy gunners no choice but to take cover or die. The modifications worked. On November 2, 1943, 38 B-25s attacked Rabaul Harbor in the largest skip bombing raid of the war. The harbor held 18 warships and 30 merchant vessels. The raid lasted 18 minutes. Results: 30 direct hits, 1 heavy cruiser sunk, 1 destroyer sunk, 2 auxiliary vessels destroyed, 16 merchant ships damaged or sinking. American losses: 2 B-25s. The exchange rate swung back in America's favor, but Rabaul proved something else. Skip bombing worked best against ships in confined waters, anchored in harbors or trapped in narrow straits, where they couldn't maneuver freely. Against convoys in open ocean, with room to dodge and fighter cover overhead, the tactic was still deadly dangerous. Against ships at anchor, it was devastating. The British adopted skip bombing in late 1943. Royal Air Force Beauforts used the technique to attack German convoys off Norway, with results mirroring the Pacific experience. High casualties, high success rates. The Germans responded by adding more anti-aircraft guns to merchant vessels and requiring convoys to sail only under heavy fighter escort. The cost of moving supplies by sea skyrocketed. Effectiveness plummeted. The Soviets used skip bombing against German ships in the Black Sea and Baltic, but their technique was cruder. Lower approach altitudes, heavier bombs, less suppressive fire. Results were mixed. Some ships sunk, many bombers lost. The Soviets had courage, but they lacked the training and equipment refinements the Americans had developed through trial and error in the Pacific. By 1944, skip bombing had evolved beyond its original form. American tactics now included coordinated multi-layered attacks. High-altitude bombers struck first, forcing ships to maneuver. Fighters strafed to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Then skip bombers came in low, while defenses were distracted and disorganized. This approach reduced losses while maintaining lethal effectiveness. Statistics told the story. Between March 1943 and August 1945, American aircraft using skip bombing sank or severely damaged 212 Japanese vessels at the cost of 47 bombers, a kill ratio of 4.5 ships per bomber. For comparison, high-altitude bombing achieved a kill ratio of just 0.3 ships per bomber. Skip bombing was 15 times more effective, but the human cost was harder to quantify. Skip bombing required crews to fly directly at ships bristling with weapons, maintaining a steady course while tracers filled the air around them. The psychological stress was immense. Pilots who flew skip bombing missions had shorter combat tours, higher rates of combat fatigue, and more frequent medical groundings for stress-related conditions. The tactic worked, but it broke the men who flew it. Lner never flew skip bombing again after May 1943. He trained new crews, watched them take off on missions using the tactic he'd helped approve, watched some of them not come back. By war's end, he'd trained 62 pilots in skip bombing. 18 killed in action, 23 wounded. The math was brutal: a 29% fatality rate, a 66% casualty rate, including wounded. Better than high-altitude bombing, worse than almost any other combat aviation role. Military historians would debate for decades whether skip bombing shortened the war. The answer was complicated. Skip bombing didn't win battles by itself, but it strangled Japanese supply lines, made reinforcement prohibitively expensive, and forced the Japanese Navy to abandon large-scale convoy operations. Without supplies, garrisons withered. Without reinforcements, defensive positions became indefensible. Islands fell one by one. What remained certain was this: on March 2nd and 3rd, 1943, 9 B-25 bombers flying at 50 feet had destroyed an entire Japanese convoy in 15 minutes of sustained combat. The tactic had been banned twice, called suicide by everyone who heard it, proven effective by men willing to fly into walls of anti-aircraft fire because the alternative was letting 7,000 enemy soldiers reach their destination. The bombers that attacked the Bismarck Sea convoy were scrapped after the war. None survived as museum pieces. Major Ed Lner returned to the United States in June 1943, 31 years old, 88 combat missions under his belt. He'd survived longer than most bomber pilots in the Pacific. The Army Air Force wanted him to train new crews, to teach them what he learned, to pass on the techniques that had worked. He refused. Lner requested and received a transfer to transport aircraft, spending the rest of the war flying C-47s, moving supplies and personnel across the Pacific. No combat, no skip bombing, no more watching crews he'd trained die in aircraft he'd taught them to fly. He never explained the decision, never had to. Command understood. Some men could keep flying combat after what they'd seen. Others couldn't. There was no shame in either choice. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in December 1943. He declined twice before accepting. He didn't want recognition. He wanted to finish the war and go home. He got his wish in September 1945, when Japan surrendered. Lner mustered out 3 months later, decorated with a Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Air Medals, and a Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds he'd never mentioned in any after-action report. Lner died in 1997 in Sacramento, California, at 85 years old. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in one sentence. It didn't mention the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, didn't mention skip bombing, didn't mention that he'd helped develop a tactic that changed naval warfare. He'd asked his family not to discuss it. They honored his request. General George Kenney received credit for skip bombing in most historical accounts. That was fine with Lner. Kenney had conceived the theory. Lner had just proven it worked. The distinction mattered to historians. It didn't matter to the pilots who flew the missions. They knew who led the first attack, who trained them, whose techniques had kept them alive when Japanese gunners tracked their approach at 50 feet. The B-25 Mitchell bomber became legendary partly because of skip bombing. The aircraft served in every theater of World War II, but its reputation was forged in the Pacific, flying missions that shouldn't have been survivable. By war's end, B-25s had sunk more enemy shipping than any other bomber type. The technique Lner and his crews had proven in March 1943 became standard doctrine for every B-25 unit in the Pacific. No museum displays a B-25 specifically flown in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The aircraft were worn out by war's end. Most were scrapped for aluminum. A few survive in museums, restored to flying condition, or displayed as static exhibits. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, has one, as does the Smithsonian. Neither flew at the Bismarck Sea, but they represent the crews who did. The battle itself is largely forgotten outside military history circles. It doesn't have the name recognition of Midway or Guadalcanal. No major films were made about it. No famous photographs captured the moment. Just after-action reports, reconnaissance images, and the testimony of men who mostly chose not to talk about what they'd done. What remains is this. In March 1943, a group of American bomber crews proved that aircraft could sink ships by skipping bombs across water at 50 feet. The tactic was called suicide before they proved it worked. It was called genius afterward. The truth was somewhere between. It was desperation meeting innovation. It was men willing to try something untested because the tested methods weren't working. It was courage measured in the split-second decision to maintain heading while anti-aircraft fire turned the air lethal. The Pacific War changed after the Bismarck Sea. Japanese convoys stopped sailing within range of Allied air power. Supply lines collapsed, garrisons starved, islands fell. The war moved closer to Japan, one island at a time, and the Japanese Navy couldn't stop it because they couldn't supply their forward positions. Skip bombing hadn't won the war by itself, but it had closed the supply route the Japanese needed to keep fighting. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do us a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to share this forgotten chapter of the Pacific War with more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're digging into dusty archives every day to rescue stories that deserve to be remembered.